The first sound was the rattling of iron. Long before the wagon was visible on the horizon, the townsfolk heard it, the slow, uneven grind of metal against metal, mingling with the creak of tired wooden wheels. It was a sound that made dogs prick their ears and children go silent mid-play. In a place where most wagons carried barrels, lumber, or sacks of grain, this one carried something heavier, darker, and far more troubling. By the time the wagon rolled into the dusty main street of Dry Creek, every window shutter had already tipped open a crack. Shopkeepers leaned against their door frames. Men on the saloon porch squinted through tobacco smoke. Women gathered their skirts, drawing their little ones closer. The lawman driving the team, Deputy Marshal Collins, looked bone-weary, dust-stained from trail miles, his face set with the stiff pride of a man who wanted everyone to see what he had hauled in, and there it was, the cage Dot had sat chained to. The wagon bed, fashioned from thick iron bars blackened with soot and rust. The bars were too close together for a man to slip a hand through, too heavy for a hacksaw to cut. This was no animal crate. It had been built for one purpose only, to hold something dangerous, something feared. And inside, hunched but upright, sat an Apache. He was still, almost statuesque, as the wagon came to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. His bare chest bore streaks of red ochre paint, smeared in patterns no white man in Dry Creek could understand. His black hair hung loose, matted from the trail, but his eyes were sharp and steady, scanning the town with neither panic nor plea. Children clutched their mothers' skirts tighter when they caught that gaze, for it seemed to pierce straight through the wood of the wagon, through the iron bars, through the heat-shimmering air itself. "Lord above," muttered the blacksmith, stepping out into the street, hammer still in hand. "What's Collins got there?" "An Apache," someone whispered. "One of the wild ones. More devil than man, they say." The whispers spread faster than wildfire on prairie grass. Some claimed he was the one who had led a raid on a mining camp 2 valleys over, cutting down men in their tents. Others swore he had slaughtered soldiers along the Salt River, vanishing before bullets could touch him. The oldest gossips muttered words like medicine man and cursed blood, and already the town began to treat him less as a prisoner than as a bad omen that had rolled right into their midst. Deputy Collins climbed down from the wagon, boots hitting the dust with a thud. He raised his voice, announcing as though to a crowd larger than the 50 souls of Dry Creek. "Caught this one outside San Pedro after a skirmish. Took 6 men and a chain of luck to bring him down alive. They call him Ghost in Iron." The name, whether real or invented, rippled through the onlookers like a chill. Ghost in Iron. It sounded like the kind of name that belonged to a spirit more than a man. The Apache in the cage made no sound, no movement, as if he had heard it all before. He simply stared forward, gaze locked not on Collins, not on the sheriff stepping out of his office, but on the town itself, on each face that dared to look at him and then, inevitably, look away. Sheriff Dobbs scratched his jaw, frowning. "What the hell you expect me to do with him, Collins? A man like that's a powder keg, and this town ain't ready for the spark." Collins spat into the dust. Orders were clear. "Hold him until the army decides what to do. You can keep him in the yard out back." The sheriff glanced at the cage, at the unmoving figure within, and for a moment it looked as though he might refuse outright. But pride and curiosity won out. He nodded slowly, as though agreeing to take custody of a wild storm. The cage was hauled down with chains and dragged behind the sheriff's office, iron grinding against dirt. Children followed at a distance, too frightened to come close but too curious to turn away. They would speak of it in hushed voices for weeks. The first day the Apache came to town in a cage. By sundown, the streets of Dry Creek were empty. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. The saloon was quiet, the poker games forgotten. It was as though the whole town held its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. But in the cage, Ghost in Iron sat motionless. His chest rose and fell, his eyes burned steady, and though he had not spoken a single word, he had already made the whole town his prisoner. By the second day, the cage was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a magnet for every tongue and imagination in Dry Creek. Folks drifted past the sheriff's yard, pretending to water their horses or check their tack, but their eyes always strayed to the figure inside the iron bars. He still hadn't spoken. He barely moved, but his silence filled the air heavier than gunpowder smoke. At night, the saloon roared with speculation. Every man claimed to know the prisoner's story, though none could agree on the details. I heard tell he wiped out a cavalry patrol outside. Tucson, muttered old Crenshaw, slamming his whiskey glass on the bar. Slit throats in their sleep, one by one. Left only the officer alive so the man could stumble back and spread the tale. That's horse dung, scoffed another. This one's a war chief, same Apache, who torched the mining camp up by Copper Ridge. 30 men gone in an hour, and not a bullet landed on him. They call him Ghost in Iron 'cause no lid can touch him. Someone else leaned in, voice hushed though the whole room was listening. He's no man at all. You look at them eyes? Cold fire, like he sees more than flesh. Medicine man. He can call storms, send rattlers crawling into your bed. Each rumor was more grotesque than the last, but the more outrageous the story, the more eagerly it was repeated. By the time midnight came, Ghost in Iron had grown into something larger than a prisoner. He had become a shadow that hung over every drink poured, every candle lit. The sheriff did his best to keep order. Sheriff Dobbs was a heavy-set man, thick-necked, with a way of puffing his chest when he felt uncertain. He's just a man, he said to anyone who'd listen. A flesh-and-blood outlaw like the rest. Don't matter how many scalps he's taken, he bleeds same as we do. But the sheriff never went near the cage after dark. Even Deputy Collins, who had hauled the Apache all the way from San Pedro, found himself uneasy. Never seen a man so still, he admitted one morning, rubbing his eyes after a restless night. Even in sleep he don't twitch, he don't cough, he don't moan. It's like watching a wolf sit and wait. You know it'll spring, you just don't know when. The townsfolk began to change their habits. Children no longer played stickball on the main street. Women kept their laundry lines closer to home. The blacksmith chained his forge door at night, muttering that the sight of the prisoner soured his fire. Only the saloon keeper, old Greeley, seemed pleased. Fear keeps a man thirsty, he chuckled, counting coins. Long as that savage is in town, my cask'll run dry before the week's out. Still, not everyone shared in the fear. A few men saw opportunity in the captive. Young Buckham, the gambler, bet openly that the Apache wouldn't last the week without water. I give him 4 days for he drops dead in that cage. Any takers? Others wagered on whether the army would come fetch him or if the sheriff would hang him first, but no one placed a bet on the Apache breaking free. That was the one thing no one dared say aloud. The prisoner himself remained a mystery. He ate little, drank less. When food was left within reach, sometimes it vanished, though no one saw him touch it. His eyes, dark as river stone, followed everything. The preacher swore the man hadn't blinked once during Sunday morning sermon, even though the cage was 40 yards from the chapel steps. By the 4th day, a title settled over him like dust, Ghost in Iron. Some said the army had already called him that. Others swore it was Apache tongues that named him. No matter where it came from, the town embraced it because it felt safer than saying the man in the cage. Late one evening, as the sky bruised purple with sunset, a boy too bold for his own good crept close to the bars. He had heard men whispering of scalps, of knives, of ghosts, and he wanted to see for himself. The boy picked up a pebble, tossed it at the prisoner, and hissed, "Hey, ghost." The Apache's head turned slowly, deliberately, until those black eyes met the boy's. Nothing more. No word. No movement. Just a stare. The boy fled, crying, and wouldn't speak for 3 days. That night, the saloon swelled with voices. Again, louder than ever, though every word was hushed. The stories grew darker, stranger, less about what the Apache had done and more about what he might do. By then, Ghost and Iron no longer needed to fight or to speak or even to move. His legend had taken root. He was no longer a man to Dry Creek. He was a storm in a cage, and the whole town felt the thunder waiting. Mary Callahan stood among the crowd the day the cage first rolled into Dry Creek, though few noticed her. Widows were easy to overlook, dressed in black, quiet, always at the edges of things. She had buried her husband 3 years prior, a soldier, who never returned from the southern campaigns. His grave sat on the hill outside town, marked by a wooden cross she hammered into the soil herself. The army had given her a folded flag, but no body, and no explanation she could trust. The town knew her as the woman who lived alone in a little clapboard house near the river bend. She kept her garden, baked her bread, and attended Sunday service. Without missing a hymn, polite but distant. Nobody disliked her, but nobody knew her well either. That suited her. Yet when the cage arrived, Mary felt a pull she couldn't name. She had seen men in uniform die, had heard the stories soldiers told around the fire when they thought no women were listening. Words like savages, raids, butcherings. But she had also read her husband's letters where he questioned the orders, where he admitted he didn't understand why they fought men who only wanted to keep their land. Letters that hinted he feared he was on the wrong side of something. So when Mary looked at the Apache in the cage, she did not see a monster. She saw a man. A man whose silence said more than all the drunken stories whispered in the saloon. First day she lingered at the edge of the yard, holding a basket of bread she had meant to deliver to the pastor's wife. The prisoner sat unmoving, eyes fixed past the crowd, but for one moment, just a flicker, his gaze landed on her. It wasn't the piercing, unblinking stare that had sent children running. It was different, softer in its steadiness. Not pleading, not threatening, simply recognition. Mary felt her stomach tighten. She turned away quickly, but that night she dreamed of those eyes, dark, steady, alive. On the second day she returned, though she told herself it was just to pass by on her way to the mercantile. The cage seemed smaller now, crueler in the heat of the afternoon sun. The Apache sat cross-legged, his back straight despite the dust and hunger. A crust of cornbread had been left near the bars untouched. Flies crawled over it. She lingered longer that time. Sheriff Dobbs noticed. "You. Best stay clear of him, Miss Callahan," he said gruffly, stepping onto the porch of his office. "Ain't nothing in that cage but trouble. Devil's fire behind those eyes." Mary lowered her gaze, but her voice was steady. "A man can't be fed on devil stories, Sheriff. He needs water." Dobbs frowned, as though the thought had never once crossed his mind. He'll get what he gets. Ain't my concern if he starves. Might even be safer for all of us. Mary said nothing more, but that evening, when no one was watching, she left a small loaf of bread near the cage. The next morning it was gone. By the third day, whispers began to circulate. The widow had been seen near the cage more than once. She was leaving food, maybe even speaking to the savage. Some said she was soft-hearted. Others said she was touched in the head, grief still gnawing at her. A few, meaner still, wondered aloud if she was lonely enough to see something in the Apache's silence that no decent woman should. Mary ignored them. She went about her work, fetched water from the well, mended her dresses, but always her steps carried her back toward the yard behind the sheriff's office. Each time she found the prisoner the same, silent, watchful, unbroken. It was not pity she felt, though that was what the town believed. It was something deeper, something she couldn't yet put into words. His presence stirred the same ache that came when she looked at her husband's empty chair by the hearth. A reminder that the world was cruel, yes, but also that cruelty could not strip a man of his dignity unless he surrendered it. Mary began to wonder if Ghost in Iron had more dignity left in him than most men she knew alive and free. And so, while others avoided the yard, she kept coming back. Standing at a distance, basket in hand, eyes on the cage, watching him, waiting, though for what, she could not say. The widow's gaze had settled on the Apache, and once it had, it never left. The town began to measure the days not by the sun's climb but by the prisoner's stillness. He had eaten almost nothing since the lawman dragged him in, and though water was sometimes set within reach, he touched it rarely. By the end of the first week, his ribs showed sharp beneath painted skin, his shoulders drawn taut as bowstr ings. And yet he never begged. He never groaned. Not once did he ask for mercy. The jailer, a nervous young deputy named Tom Garvey, tried once to speak to him through the bars. "You'll die if you keep on like this," Tom said, holding out a tin cup of water. "Even wild dogs drink when they're thirsty." The Apache only looked at him. That same steady gaze, black as midnight. Tom lasted 2 seconds before he muttered a curse, slammed the cup down on the ground, and stormed away. The townsfolk watched from a distance, whispering. Some said he had sworn a warrior's vow not to eat the white man's bread, not to drink the white man's water. Others said he was feeding on something else, hatred, maybe, or spirits that kept him alive. More than one man muttered that starvation wouldn't kill him, that he'd rise leaner, stronger. The day the bars finally bent, children were kept away now, save for the bravest few who dared each other to creep close at dusk. One swore he heard the Apache chanting under his breath. Another claimed he saw his eyes glowing like embers. Truth and tale twisted together until nobody could tell one from the other. Mary Callahan saw something different each evening. When her chores were done, she walked past the yard with a loaf wrapped in cloth. She never handed it to him directly, that would have drawn too many eyes, but she always left it near enough that he could reach if he wished. Sometimes in the morning it was gone. Other times, untouched, as though pride or mistrust had outweighed hunger. The widow began to study him quietly, in the way women study things men overlook. She saw the way his posture never faltered, even when his frame grew gaunt. She noticed how his eyes tracked not just people, but the sky, the wind, shadows stretching long at sundown. He was watching the land itself, as if it still spoke to him even from inside a cage. And though he never spoke a word, his silence began to speak louder than any man in town. At the saloon, the stories grew darker. "He's waitin'," said Greeley, polishing a glass. "Waitin' to die his way, so his spirit can slip free and come for us after dark." Laughter followed, nervous and shallow. Nobody liked to admit that. Deep down, they feared the joke was true. Sheriff Dobbs grew short-tempered. He didn't like how the widow's bread kept disappearing. Didn't like how folks kept peering through the fence as if waiting for a miracle or a massacre. "It's a cage, not a sideshow," he barked one afternoon, chasing away a knot of farmhands. But his words carried no weight. The cage had already become the beating heart of Dry Creek. On the 7th night, Mary returned later than usual, lantern in hand. The street was empty, the sky swollen with stars. She stopped at the yard gate, her breath clouding faint in a chill. The Apache sat as always, cross-legged, hands resting loosely on his knees. But this time his eyes were closed. For the first time, he looked almost human in his exhaustion. His cheekbones stood sharp, his chest shallow with each breath. Mary set the bread down, her hand lingering a moment on the cloth, and for reasons she could not explain, she whispered, "Eat, please." The sound of her voice startled her. She hadn't meant to speak. The Apache opened his eyes slowly, as though he had been awake the whole time. His gaze met hers, calm and unbroken. He said nothing, but the faintest flicker passed across his face, not a smile, not a scowl, something closer to acknowledgement. Mary's throat tightened. She turned quickly and walked home, her lantern swinging, her shadow stretching long behind. Her dot by morning, the bread was gone. The town would talk, of course, they always did. But the widow knew something none of them did, that in the silence of the cage, in the hunger that no white man could understand, the Apache had chosen not to bow. And for reasons she dared not name, that truth mattered more to her than all their rumors combined. By the second week, Dry Creek had turned the cage into a kind of ritual. Men stopped by after supper just to see if the Apache still breathed. Women carried gossip as readily as flour and sugar. The preacher warned from his pulpit that Satan had many faces, and one of them sat behind the sheriff's office. Mary Callahan said nothing. She baked her bread, mended her linens, and tended her small garden. But each evening her path carried her near the yard. Her neighbors noticed. They always did. "The widow's gone soft," they whispered. "She pities the savage." On the 12th night, she found herself in the saloon, a place she rarely entered. The air inside was thick with pipe smoke and whiskey breath, the floor sticky with old beer. Men turned their heads as she walked in, surprise crackling through the room. Widow Callahan didn't belong among card tables and spittoons, but she stood straighter than most of them, sitting down at the far end. Sheriff Dobbs was holding court, leaning heavy on the bar with a glass in his hand. His voice carried over. The piano's tired tune. "Mark my words, gentlemen, he'll break before the month is out. Savage's got pride, sure, but pride don't fill the belly. He'll beg yet." The room laughed with him, though some of it sounded hollow. Mary stepped forward, her black dress brushing the floorboards. The laughter faltered. Men turned in their chairs. Dobbs looked up, blinking in surprise. "Miss Callahan," he said, forcing a smile. "Didn't reckon to see you here." Her hand trembled slightly inside her pocket, where she clutched the cool band of gold she had carried for 3 years, the only thing of her husband's the army had returned. She had told herself she would never part with it. But tonight her resolve had changed. "I've come to buy him," she said. The room went still. The piano struck a sour note and stopped. "Buy who?" Dobbs asked, though his eyes flickered. "With understanding, the Apache," she said, her voice even. "The man you keep locked in that cage. I'll buy his life." For a heartbeat, silence hung like a noose. Then the room erupted. Laughter spilled out boisterous, disbelieving. Half a dozen men slapping their knees and hollering. One spat beer onto the floor. "The widow wants herself a wild buck," someone jeered. Mary didn't flinch. She withdrew her hand from her pocket and laid the ring on the bar. The lamplight caught the band, dull from years of wear but still solid gold. The laughter ebbed into murmurs. Dobbs stared at it. Greed flickered in his eyes, though he tried to mask it with a scoff. "That's a soldier's ring." "It was my husband's," Mary said softly. "It's worth more than a starving man in a cage. I'll give it to you if you turn him over to me." Gasps circled the room. No one had expected such boldness. The sheriff glanced around, gauging the crowd. Half of them were grinning, waiting for him to mock her. The other half sat uneasy, as if they sensed something had shifted in the air. "You'd waste your husband's memory on a savage?" Dobbs drawled. Mary met his gaze without flinching. I'd use it to buy dignity for him, if not for you." The words hit like a whip crack. A few men muttered curses. Someone snorted, but no one laughed outright now. Dobbs hesitated, his thick fingers tapping the bar. He thought of the army and their orders. He thought of the risk of keeping the Apache longer, of the restless eyes of the townsfolk. But mostly, he thought of the gold ring. The army wouldn't pay him a cent. The widow's ring, however, could. Buy him a new Winchester or a month's worth of poker chips. With a sneer, he plucked the ring from the bar and slipped it into his vest pocket. "Fine," he said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "He's yours. But don't come crying when he slits your throat in your sleep." Mary inclined her head. "That will be my risk, Sheriff." The men in the saloon watched her walk. Out, their faces a mixture of awe, disbelief, and something else fear. For it wasn't the Apache who had defied the sheriff that night. It was the widow Dot, and by the time the door closed behind her, the whole town knew that Dry Creek's strangest bargain had just been struck. A wedding ring for a man in a cage. Word of the widow's bargain swept through Dry Creek before the sun rose. By morning, it had already stretched into legend. Men claimed Mary Callahan had bewitched Sheriff Dobbs with witchcraft. Women muttered she'd lost her mind from loneliness. The children, wide-eyed, whispered that the Apache was already free, stalking the alleys by moonlight. The truth was simpler. The ring now sat snug in Sheriff Dobbs's vest pocket, and the Apache still crouched in the cage behind the office. Dobbs strutted through town like a man who had won a hand of poker on a bluff. He bought drinks he didn't need, slapped men on the back too hard, and told anyone who would listen that he'd tricked the widow out of her gold. She'd get nothing but trouble for her coin, he boasted to Greeley in the saloon, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "That savage is a snake in boots. Let her keep him. See how long till he bites." But underneath the sheriff's bravado lay something meaner, smaller. Dobbs had spent years puffing himself up as the strongest man in Dry Creek, the one who could stare down drunks and outlaws alike. And yet, standing before the widow the night before, he had felt a prickle of shame when she'd spoken of dignity. He didn't like the memory of it, so he drowned it in whiskey and laughter. The army's orders worried him, too. Collins had been clear when he hauled the prisoner in, hold him until soldiers arrived to claim him. If word got out that Dobbs had sold him like a mule, there might be consequences. But Dobbs reasoned with himself quickly enough. By the time the army came, the widow would be the one holding the Apache, not him. And if trouble followed, well, who'd argue with a grieving woman? Folks would just say grief made her foolish. By midday, the town was buzzing. Men gathered in knots outside the mercantile, voices pitched low but urgent. Some argued she'd brought a curse on them all. Others wondered if the Apache would keep her as some kind of servant or worse. More than one spat in the dirt and muttered that no decent woman would give herself to a savage. The blacksmith shook his head. "Don't you fools see? She's done what none of us dared." She looked him in the eye and didn't blink. That's worth something. But his words were drowned in the tide of rumor and fear. Inside the sheriff's office, Dobbs sat at his desk, turning the gold ring over in his fingers. It gleamed dully in the afternoon light, the weight of it heavier than he liked to admit. He imagined what it could fetch in Tucson, enough for a rifle, a new saddle, maybe a few nights at a gaming table. Collins, the deputy marshal, leaned in the doorway. "You sure about this, Dobbs? The army won't take kindly to finding him." "Gone." Dobbs scowled. "She paid. He's hers. Ain't no law against selling property." "He's not property," Collins muttered. "He's a prisoner of war." Dobbs's lip curled. "War's over when a man's in a cage. She wants him. She's got him. Don't trouble yourself." But Collins didn't look convinced. He turned and walked out, leaving Dobbs alone with the ring and the nagging itch that maybe he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That evening, Mary Callahan arrived to claim what was hers. She wore the same plain black dress, her hair pinned back, her face calm as stone. A small crowd gathered at a distance, watching from doorways and porches. Dobbs puffed himself up as he unlocked the gate. There he is, Miss Callahan. Savage. In all his glory. Don't say I didn't warn you. Mary said nothing. Her eyes slid past the sheriff, past the gawkers, and fixed on the man in the cage. He sat as always, silent and still, though thinner now, the bones of his shoulders cutting sharp under the skin. But his eyes found hers, and for a moment the noise of the town fell away. Dobbs noticed the look between them and felt his stomach twist. He told himself it was disgust. He told himself it was proof she was touched in the head. But beneath it, deeper down, lay the truth he could not speak. In that single exchange of glances, the Apache had given the widow more respect than Dobbs had ever received in his life. He shoved the thought aside with a bark of laughter, fumbling with the heavy key. All right then, Miss Callahan, let's see what kind of wife a savage makes. The lock clicked. The cage was ready to open. The yard behind the sheriff's office had gone quiet as a church at midnight. Every man, woman, and child who dared watch held their breath, waiting for the moment iron gave way to fleshed-out Sheriff Dobbs made a show of it, jangling the heavy key in his hand as if it were a talisman. He liked the weight of eyes on him, liked it less when he remembered half of those eyes were waiting not for him but for the Apache. Still, he puffed his chest, spat into the dust, and slid the key in two. The locked out the iron door shrieked on its hinges. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the cage stood open. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men shifted hands toward the butts of their pistols. The air itself seemed to tighten, strung taut like a fiddle string. The Apache did not move. He sat cross-legged, his back straight, eyes steady on the seat, and widow standing just beyond the threshold. He looked at her as if the sheriff, the town, the cage itself had vanished, and there were only the two of them. Go on, Dobbs sneered. He's yours now. Take him, if you dare. Mary Callahan stepped forward. The weight of the crowd pressed on her shoulders, but she moved with the same quiet determination she had carried into the saloon. She stopped just short of the bars, her black dress stirring faintly in the breeze. For a long heartbeat, nothing happened. The prisoner's eyes flickered downward, then back up, measuring her, as though confirming what he already knew. Then, with slow grace, he unfolded from the ground and rose to his full height. The crowd murmured. He was taller than most had realized, gaunt from hunger, but still strong, his frame taut with wiry muscle. He stepped forward, one hand brushing against the bars as he passed through the open door. Not a sound came from him, no growl, no shout, not even the rattle of chains, for Dobbs had left him bound only by hunger. The people of Dry Creek shrank. Back a step. Here was the moment they had feared, the moment stories warned of, the Apache loose among them. But he did not lunge, did not bare his teeth, did not strike. Instead, he paused just beyond the cage and bowed his head slightly toward Mary Callahan. It was not a gesture of submission. It was acknowledgment man to woman, survivor to survivor. Mary inclined her head in return. Her voice was steady, though her heart beat against her ribs. "Come with me," she said, and he did. They walked together across the yard, her step small and deliberate, his stride long and measured. The crowd parted without realizing it, each person drawing back as though an invisible force pushed them aside. Silence clung to the street, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel. Sheriff Dobbs watched with a scowl, his fingers twitching near his holster though he dared not draw. Something in the Apache's stillness unsettled him more than any display of violence could have. He had expected rage, blood, a spectacle that would vindicate his warnings. Instead, he saw control, dignity, and it made him feel smaller than ever. From the saloon porch, old Greeley whispered hoarsely, "By God, she's done it. She's really done it." The widow and the Apache reached the edge of the street. She turned toward the path that led to her small house by the river bend, and without a word, he followed. His bare feet stirred little dust, his eyes scanning the horizon like a man reacquainting himself with freedom. Behind them, the town of Dry Creek stood frozen, watching them go. Some faces were pale with fear, others twisted with anger, a few softened with awe. None spoke. None dared. When the pair finally disappeared around the bend, the spell broke. Voices erupted harsh, disbelieving, angry, afraid. "She's lost her mind. He'll kill her before morning. She's brought ruin on us all." Sheriff Dobbs barked for order, but no one listened. The cage stood empty behind him, its door yawning wide like a broken jaw, and though he had traded it for gold, he felt only the gnaw of shame. That night, every lamp in Dry Creek burned late. Every lock was checked twice. Every man kept a rifle near his bed. For the first time, the town truly understood what it meant to fear silence, because the Apache was no longer behind iron. He was walking free beside the widow, and nothing felt safe again. The morning after the cage was emptied, Dry Creek woke to a different silence than it had ever known. It was not the silence of dawn before the rooster crowed, nor the silence after Sunday prayer. This was a silence of watchfulness, as though the very air leaned in to listen. Men opened their doors with rifles in hand. Women stepped out to hang laundry but kept their children close, eyes darting toward the bend in the road where the widow's house stood. Even the dogs slunk low, ears pinned back, as if they, too, felt the weight of something unspoken. But nothing happened. The widow did not scream. Smoke rose steady from her chimney. No Apache raiding party descended on the town. Life, it seemed, continued, though no one admitted aloud that they were waiting for blood. On the second day, young Tom Garvey, the deputy, claimed he saw the Apache walking the widow's garden in the cool of morning, barefoot, bare-chested, his face turned to the sun. Tom swore he wasn't chained, wasn't bound, just free. Like he belonged there, Tom said, and though most dismissed it, the story rooted itself in whispers. On the fourth day, a rancher riding in from the east told of crossing paths with the widow on the trail. She rode side by side with the Apache as if they were kin, silent but not afraid. "She even tipped her hat to me," the rancher said, shaking his head. Like nothing was out of sorts, the town shivered with such tales. Some swore the widow had bewitched him with charms. Others muttered she had betrayed her husband's memory and was lying down with the enemy. The harshest said she'd doomed them all. But weeks passed. No raids came. No barns were burned. No cattle stolen. The Apache who had terrified Dry Creek, by sitting silent in a cage, now seemed to guard its borders. Simply by walking free beside the widow, children began to wander farther from their doors again. The blacksmith stoked his forge without looking over his shoulder. Even Sheriff Dobbs, though he spat whenever the widow's name was mentioned, began to sleep without keeping his pistol at arm's reach. In time, the cage rusted in the sheriff's yard, forgotten and overgrown with weeds. Years later, old men on the saloon porch would still tell the story. They'd lean forward, squinting through smoke, and whisper of the day the Apache came to town in chains. They'd tell how fear gripped every soul until a widow, dressed in black, offered her wedding ring to set him free. Some swore she'd been foolish, that he killed her and vanished into the hills, never to be seen again. Others claimed she lived. Long after, side by side with him, untouched by raid or war, protected by the respect he bore her. A few, eyes bright with whiskey, insisted they had seen him still, an old man walking the ridges at sunset, silent as ever. Watching over the valley. No one agreed on the ending, but all agreed on this. After the widow took the Apache from his cage, no harm ever came to Dry Creek from his people again. Whether it was chance, treaty, or something more, the town never knew. And so the story lingered, as heavy as desert heat and as enduring as stone. In the end, Ghost and Iron remained exactly what he had been when the cage first rolled into town, an enigma. Not a monster, not a savior. Something larger, something the town could not name. And the widow who had bought his freedom with her husband's ring remained just as mysterious, her reasons buried with her, her choice echoing long after her death. Dry Creek never forgot, and whenever a traveler asked about the rusting cage behind the sheriff's office, the townsfolk lowered their voices, their eyes drifting to the river bend, and told the story again. Everyone feared the Apache in the cage until the widow gave him her wedding ring. After that, fear was never the same.